go. So, yeah, I think it's Manisha. Am I pronouncing your name right first?
It's
Manisha?
like Manisha. It's as if it was
Manisha.
a double E. Yeah.
Okay, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Manisha, you were saying that you have like a cocktail, and I think that's really important for all of our viewers to know too. Is like if you don't like hard liquor or you're just kind of trying things out, it's really okay to just try a cocktail, maybe a little bit sweeter, because you'll start to learn the way that different, for example, like we Varsha and I talk a lot about bourbons and whiskeys here, but like they have a lot of very different tastes, and so
Yeah.
like you can't like say that all bourbons taste like this or all vodkas taste like this or gins taste like this, because they're really quite different. We're spoiled by some of our college experiences in which we had no money and we bought the cheapest thing, and so we thought that's what these things taste like, and no, that's not what they taste like at all.
That's exactly how I sort of taught myself to become a whiskey drinker, because for the longest time I stayed away from whiskey, because my first ever drink of whiskey was I was a freshman and I had a drink of Jack Daniels, and I decided, no, this is a mistake. Never again shall I drink whiskey. This is the worst drink ever created. And only later did I realize, oh, there are better whiskeys than this. And I sort of taught myself slowly by, I would make whiskey and Cokes, and I would put less and less Coke in it over time. And I sort of taught myself how to enjoy it. So, yeah.
Well, whiskey is a big thing in India, because people drink more Scotch whiskey than is actually produced. So I don't know where that other Scotch is coming from, but my father is a big fan of Black Label, Scotch, and also, the single malts, Glenfiddich, Glenlivet.
Yeah.
I'd have a sip of that and think, this is god awful. So he never taught me how to appreciate his whiskey. And bourbon, forget about it. I'm not even.
I'm a typical Indian person. Every week, my parents will call me. They're like, "You only had 1 ounce, right? You can't keep drinking so much." My dad always gets frustrated. He gets frustrated that I drink, but then at the same time, he's like, "Can I try that bottle? That bottle looks good."
I think my husband made up for it a little bit, because he started joining my father for a scotch, every evening, and I'm like, there you go, you have somebody to try it on. Yeah, so I'm having a vodka martini made by my husband, and as I was just telling Matt, I actually like the olives soaked in the vodka martini better than the vodka martini. So yeah, that's
like
I'm such a
no.
I'm sorry. Cheers.
Yeah, no, cheers. Yes, cheers. So yeah, and welcome to I was gonna say I didn't realize this until we had actually hopped on, and I'm doing math in my head, which as a historian is not my strong suit, right? But I think this is episode 20 of Drinking with Historians. So we've hit like a nice round number, and we're incredibly privileged to have our guest here, Professor Manisha Sinha, who is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut. She has an amazing book called The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum, South Carolina. She has another book coming out soon, maybe. We'll talk about that on Reconstruction, the Reconstruction of American Democracy after the American Civil War. And so thank you all for spending a Friday afternoon with us. We've already heard what Professor Sinha is drinking. I myself have a Sazerac. I promised I would make a Sazerac, and that's mostly because I'm incredibly susceptible, and I saw somebody tweet about a Sazerac earlier, and I was like, man, that sounds great. So I decided to make myself a Sazerac with just an absinthe wash around the glass to give it kind of a smell and just a little bit of a flavor. Some whiskey. I used Uncle Nearest, what is it, 1856, which is an amazing Tennessee whiskey, instead of rye, a black-owned distiller. And then a little bit of Peychaud's bitters, Angostura bitters, and just a little bit of simple syrup. So it's absolutely wonderful. It's great. It's a little bit warm here. It's like a weird fall Virginia day, and so it's just evening, I guess, but it's kind of perfect. So, and Varsha, you're probably drinking whiskey too, I would guess.
Yes, I am drinking whiskey. I had a long week. I had to write. I'm co-authoring a chapter for this edited volume, so the deadline was this morning. So I had a long week of editing, and so to celebrate, I am drinking Blanton's because it is my favorite bourbon, and I need to wash the week away. And that's bourbon only does that for me. So that's what I have today.
Fantastic. So I think if it's okay, I mean, Manisha, I'd like to jump in, and because it's appropriate that we're having you tonight as a historian of the American Civil War and of Reconstruction, because I heard some stuff at the debate last night, and I just need a fact check on this. So President Trump apparently said he's not actually Abraham Lincoln, but he's almost as good as Abraham Lincoln. Is that true? Because I know in your writing you've compared him to another president, right?
Absolutely. I've compared him to Andrew Johnson, who is the man who became president by accident, right, when Lincoln was assassinated. And he just happens to be, one of the worst and one of the most racist presidents in American history. So to see Trump comparing himself to Johnson, and then actually taking Biden's retort literally when Biden said Abraham Lincoln here, really sarcastically, he says, wait, you think I'm Abraham Lincoln? He actually took it literally. So yeah, with Trump, it's sometimes even difficult to say whether he is saying these things that he really believes in, or he's just saying them randomly as he always does. But it's sacrilege to compare himself to Lincoln, and he shouldn't be talking about him.
So given that there is this like huge cult following around certain presidents, right? Like not just Lincoln, but like Washington, some people are in love with FDR. I myself am, some people like JFK, LBJ. What is it about Lincoln that attracts so much attention? And does he deserve all of it?
Well, Lincoln, it just is one of, if you are a historian and you're doing research and you're reading Lincoln's speeches, and I read every word that Lincoln ever wrote, and he wrote a lot, his letters, and it's not just his speeches that are so eloquent, but just read his letters to, other politicians. I mean, who writes like that? Who speaks like that? Here's a completely self-taught guy, and it's really difficult if you're a Civil War historian not to get sucked into Lincolnia, because the man just writes beautifully and he expresses things in a way that just like grabs you, right? So, for instance, he has this great piece that he wrote just in a piece of paper, and he didn't even send it to anyone. It was as if he was writing it to himself. It's in the 1850s, and he's trying to illustrate the illogic of slavery. So he says, look, A tells B, I have a right to enslave you because you have a dark skin. And then he says, well, be careful. The first person you meet who has a darker skin than you, has the right to enslave you. Well, you say it's not a matter of the skin color, it's intelligence. Well, be careful. The first person you meet who is, smarter than you has the right to enslave you. And he just keeps doing that. And this is just like a fragment that he wrote. He didn't even use it in any of his speeches, because people keep pouring through the Lincoln Douglas debates and saying, what is Lincoln saying about race? Okay, he's against slavery, but he's not endorsing Black citizenship. In fact, he's being very clever by moderating his position to his audiences, etc. But it's really these kinds of writings of Lincoln that really get to you. So to see a man like Trump, who is so inept and who clearly can't string a sentence together sometimes, compare himself to Lincoln, leave alone, in terms of his record on race or Black rights. The idea that he is anywhere near the man, and how he did that funny interview at the Lincoln Memorial. I mean, it was just, if you're a Civil War historian, it's quite galling.
I think, so if I could kind of follow up on that, because again, like I'm a simple historian. I'm going to embarrass my mother, who is an American. She was an American history, a middle school teacher right now, with my paltry American history knowledge. But I comfort myself, but I'm a medievalist, and again, like anything after 1200, like I'm a little hazy on nowadays. So it's weird to understand the modern world. But anyway, that's an aside. Sorry. So Lincoln himself underwent an evolution on slavery, like over the course of his career, right? And so one of the things that I've always been curious about is like what seemed to engender that? Because I think that the way that oftentimes American history is taught, not at the college level, and oftentimes not at the the K-12 level even, but in this kind of this kind of cultural milieu that we have, in which we kind of know something about American history, is that there were these very bright lines between kind of abolitionism and this kind of the slave power. And I think Lincoln is a really interesting way of illustrating that that's not the case. Is that fair, or am I totally off base here?
Well, you're doing your mother proud right now, Matt.
Okay.
I mean, Lincoln was not an abolitionist, for sure. He did not belong to an abolitionist society. He was a colonizationist for a long time. He recommended that, in fact, free African Americans should be shipped back to Liberia because it was the only way to solve, quote, the race problem in the United States. And, he was following a whole slew of statesmen then, like, his, quote, beau ideal, Henry Clay and others like Jefferson and Madison, who all were colonizationists. But he was genuinely anti-slavery. Lincoln was an anti-slavery politician, and you can trace that actually right back to the 1830s when he's talking about attacks on abolitionists. And he's in the state legislature. He's an ambitious guy. And in Illinois at that time, taking a racially liberal position was not exactly doing you any good in state politics. And he does take those stances. So they're kind of two standard interpretations of Lincoln. One is the kind of hagiographic stuff that Allen Guelzo and other write. This guy was the great emancipator. He was born with the pen to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, he was just like great. And the other is what many other historians who studied Lincoln, including my mentor, Eric Foner, who wrote a book on Lincoln and slavery, talk about his evolving views on slavery, how he evolves, how he goes from being a non-extensionist to an abolitionist. And finally, before he dies, he's endorsing Black citizenship. So that's a big evolution from colonization to equal rights for African Americans in the American Republic. I see it a bit differently, and I'm going to talk about it in this book, but I have written a couple of articles on this, and it was then my previous book too, In the Slave's Cause, where I talk about how Lincoln really has these sort of struggling political loyalties to anti-slavery, and you can dig up 100 quotes from Lincoln, like really condemning slavery in very abolitionist terms. And then he has this loyalty to the union with slaveholders. So he says, the fugitive slave law, it's really bad, the draconian one that is passed in 1850, but we need to follow it because it's constitutional. And then he has his loyalty to the Constitution as a lawyer. And these are three sort of competing loyalties for him. It's not that one is above the other. And you can see him torn when talking about the issue of slavery in the American Republic throughout the 1850s, all his great speeches, right? The Prelude to Greatness speeches, his Peoria speech, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, or his reaction to the Dred Scott decision, which is an amazing speech too. But the Civil War kind of solves that dilemma for him because slaveholders break the Union and commit treason. And they shred the Constitution by claiming a right to secession, which actually doesn't exist in the United States Constitution. So I think the Civil War really helps Lincoln move from non-extension to abolition for that reason. Not because he's just evolving and growing, it's because he can finally align his anti-slavery beliefs with his loyalty to the Union and the Constitution. And so it's very different than the two standard interpretations. That's the way I view him. And I also view him in the context of the abolition movement, because there are a ton of Black and white abolitionists who are arguing for Black citizenship, actually from the 18th century on, my book contends, right? So he's late to that game, but the point remains that he comes to that. So it's not exactly the evolving Lincoln, it's a little different than that. And that's how I understand him. He's an anti-slavery politician who lands on abolitionist ground.
Oh,
yeah. That's really interesting. And I think the reason, I asked about this is because I make the mistake whenever I get in the back of an Uber or tell anybody what I'm doing, that I'm a US historian. They will immediately I promise you, I think I have a tally somewhere. Like, at least it's happened to me at least 20, 30 times. They'll ask me something about the Civil War. And the thing is, I'm a 20th century historian. So what I know about the Civil War is very limited. But one of the questions I have is, I think on the naturalization exam, one of the practice questions they have is, what was the cause of the Civil War? And the possible answers you can give on the exam, because I took this exam in 2017, is slavery, taxes, or states' rights. I think it was tariffs. I think it might have been tariffs. But basically, those are the three possible answers. And so my question is, when you teach the Civil War at the college level or even at the high school level, what do you really focus on when students are confused about the cause? Because for some reason, Americans to this day are still confused about the cause. And so is it like, how important is it to focus on the tariff or this so-called issue of states' rights?
Great question, Varsha, because my first book is all about that. My first book, which looked at the growth of pro-slavery ideology and secession sentiment in the South, particularly looking at South Carolina as kind of a leader in that movement, went from the Nullification Crisis, which is over the tariff, to secession, right? And basically, if you look at the Nullification Crisis, all they're saying about the tariff is like, if the federal government can pass tariff laws that we don't like, tomorrow they're going to abolish slavery. So every time you look at tariff or states' rights, the states' right to do what? It's not the state's right to nurture local democracy. It's the state's right to protect slavery against any outside intervention, particularly intervention from the federal government. And they say that repeatedly. And so the guy I really studied a lot was Calhoun. He's another person who, I read every word the guy wrote, and that was not very pleasant. Because unlike Lincoln, he's a turgid writer. Of course, he's a pro-slavery fanatic, and he's like completely racist. And when I was writing my dissertation, which became my first book, everyone would say, oh yeah, Calhoun, he's like, Milton Satan. He's a great guy in the wrong cause. And I'm like, no, I mean, his ideas, you could easily poke holes in them. Every time he makes a speech in Congress, it's kind of pathetic. It's a lot like hearing, Ted Cruz today. So I'm like, this is not any great genius, even in the service of evil. In fact, it's a rather pedestrian mind. And so I really I keep telling my students this because they hear this from their parents. Their parents went to school and they were taught it's all about states' rights. And I'm talking about, Massachusetts and Connecticut, not, the South. So it's actually quite shocking how the South was able to sort of spin this lost cause mythology of the Civil War for such a long time and how entrenched that is. And I'm like, a state's right to do what? What is the state's rights? Why are they worried about a federal government? Why are they worried about federal government incursions in their daily lives? And if you look at what happens later on in our times, states' rights continues to be used for highly reactionary purposes. It's a state's right to, not follow, let's say, the Affordable Care Act. It's a state's right to opt out from certain federal guidelines for voting, let's say, and other things. So it continues to be used in reactionary ways. Of course, it was kind of reinforced with the reaction to the civil rights movement too. So yeah, I always, sort of get them to think a little bit about both the tariff and the states' rights issues and give them material to actually read this and say, what is Calhoun saying that South Carolina has the right to nullify a federal tariff law? Why is he saying that? Let's read his Fort Hill letter. Let's read his speeches where he is making this claim that the next thing the federal government is going to do is come after your slaves. So it's easy to make those connections. So I think it's important not to dismiss it and say, oh no, it has nothing to do with tariff and states' rights, because actually it's there. It's there in the historical record, but you need to illustrate why it matters and how it is linked to pro-slavery politics.
Really interesting. I guess my next question is also about teaching, but it's specifically about periodization, because I've taught the US history survey, the early US history survey twice now, and I've taught the second half twice. And I've realized after teaching it, what really bugs me is that the early part of the US history survey, the first half, gets cut off at 1865. So I guess my question to you is, should it be cut off at 1877 or another year? Like, does Reconstruction, should it be taught alongside slavery or alongside the Civil War? And if so, like, why?
Yeah, so I teach the first half of the survey always, and I think Reconstruction ought to be taught as part of the first half, especially with the second half. Look, I mean, it keeps growing, right? And people used to teach it up to, the civil rights movement and then to the 1970s, and now they have to come right down to the 21st century. So I think Reconstruction belongs to that survey because it's actually a sort of an ending point to that entire struggle over slavery and Black citizenship. And its eventual overthrow. So I always teach Reconstruction in the first half of the survey. And I think many schools do that. There are others that ended in 1865, but I think increasingly most places are going up to Reconstruction. Of course, what happens is in the second half of the survey, I found my colleague picking up from Reconstruction. So Reconstruction was being taught twice, by me and then by him, which was fine. But yeah, 1865, you just get to the 13th Amendment, what about the 14th and the 15th? And, yeah, it's not a great ending point.
So this is, if I'm remembering correctly, so this is the focus of your new research, right? Is about Reconstruction, right? So what is it about Reconstruction? Because that's one of the things, like, I mean, I'm not that old. I mean, I am pretty old, but I'm not that old. But I remember too, the U.S. history courses that I took, like we actually, I mean, one of the things that the survey did is it skipped Reconstruction, right? Is you get up through the end of the Civil War and then you kind of pick up like late in the 19th century or something like that. It's just like, oh, I don't know what happened in there. But I think that a really important corrective that's been happening, right, is that the re-emphasis of the importance of Reconstruction, not just, as you mentioned, Eric Foner's work, but your own, and then so many other scholars as well. So what is so important about Reconstruction that it needs to be brought back into this conversation?
So, I think there's so many things about Reconstruction that speak to many of the issues that we are still struggling with today. If you think about something like even mass incarceration and the criminalization of Blackness, you can go right back to the Black codes that were passed under Johnson's state governments and then, reimagined after the fall of Reconstruction. So it's really important, I think, to study Reconstruction. And, as you said, my mentor, Eric Foner, wrote the book on Reconstruction. It's the Bible of Reconstruction. He wrote a short version of it too, to use with students, right? Varsha, you probably know that.
Yeah, I've had to read both at different times. Yeah.
Yeah, so I actually read that in manuscript form. I was a grad student in his class when he was writing, and everyone just volunteered to we were assigned to lead the class discussion each week, and I somehow got assigned his manuscript, his 1,000-page manuscript, and it was the first semester at Columbia, and I was really, and I have to do this. And so I did my report on it, and he liked it so much. He says, I'm going to use some of this for my introduction. And I was like, whoa, great, thank you. Because I really worked hard on it. Because can you imagine having to do that in your first semester? In any case, so I never thought I would write a book on Reconstruction. I mean, I really thought Eric has written the book on it. But there's been so much work done now for that period in terms of, Western history, women's history. I just think that it's about time we had a sort of another evaluation of Reconstruction. And having just finished that book on abolition, I really wanted to see what happened to the abolitionist political project. What happened to that project of establishing an interracial democracy and Black citizenship. So I decided, I would jump into the fire and write another kind of book. So it's not going to be like a big kind of magnum opus. I think I did that with the abolition book. And frankly, I don't want to spend another 10 years of my life writing that. It's also under contract with a commercial publisher, and apparently they just won't indulge me. They have a very strict word count. So I'm really hoping to write a new history of Reconstruction that you could use, Varsha, hopefully, in your classes.
Hopefully.
if you taught the survey in US history. But also something that, ordinary American citizens outside academia can read too. Because as I said, there's so many of these issues that still sort of resonate today and whose legacy which we still live with. That's how I'm, planning the book right now.
Yeah, I don't think it was so. The first time I read Eric Foner, so there's very few people I become starstruck with, and I still have not met your mentor, but I know the day I do meet him, I swear I will like faint, because he was the first. He was the first historian when I took AP US history in high school. Over the summer, our teacher assigned us an article by him called "Who Owns History," and it was about historiography. The first time I read the term historiography, immediately fell in love, even more in love with the discipline, right? But when I read, the Unfinished Revolution, and I read that thesis, I really got to thinking about how much Reconstruction and the failure of Reconstruction is ignored. But then there was another book that blew my mind even more, and when I was reading for comps, it was Elliot West's his article on Greater Reconstruction, right, and his article on the Last Indian War. So I guess my question is, do you get a chance to incorporate the West and the story of the West into the story of Reconstruction in your book? Because very few people besides Elliot West have really gotten a chance to look at that.
Yeah, so this notion of doing a sort of a greater Reconstruction look, we do that all the time now. The long civil rights movement, the long 19th century. I don't know what it is for medievalists, like the long bad, is it? I have no idea. But, that's become fashionable in all kinds of fields. But I think Elliot West is making a very important point. And the point is that this is the period also that coincides with the dispossession of the Plains Indians in the West. And, he takes a very longue durée look at it. He begins with the Mexican War and he ends, way into the conquest of the West. There are others like Richard White, etc., who also use the Greater Reconstruction framework, not so much for Indian history, which is kind of interesting because he, is a historian of Native Americans himself. But he looks at it more as sort of collapsing Reconstruction with the Gilded Age, seeing the emergence of a powerful nation state, right? And I adopt the Greater Reconstruction framework, but my ideas are a little different than theirs. I don't see this kind of irony that a lot of historians now like to play on, which is, hey, they're enfranchising Black people, but at the same time, they're divesting Native Americans. It's all going hand in hand. It's not that simple or conspiratorial, I look at what I see as a certain contestation going on about defining the nature of the nation state, right? This is the height of liberal nationalism all over the world. It's Europe, it's German unification, Italian unification. It's also the emergence of a strong central state in the United States. A lot of people have talked about it, like Richard Bensel, et cetera, political scientists have talked about it. And I really think of it as this contestation going on between what the nation state should stand for. I don't see it as the same thing, right? And that's why I end the book with looking at the overthrow of Reconstruction, because I don't think Reconstruction was a failure. It was overthrown through a program of systematic racial terror in the South. So they kind of perfected there. And then, of course, after that is over, nearly all those sometimes the same officers are posted to the West to fight against Native Americans and divest them of their lands. The same generals show up, in the West. Certainly Sherman goes from the South. It's quite clear, and he is very anti-Indian in his attitudes later on. So I'm trying to figure out here, what happens when the program of interracialism, the program of having this sort of national definition of citizenship, regardless of race and regardless of origin or previous condition of servitude, what happens when that high-flown language is completely dismantled? And when you get overt white supremacy operating and the state becomes highly repressive, It cuts back. I mean, the Freedmen's Bureau is no longer there. There's no such thing as a social or welfare state as we understand it for the 20th century. And instead you have this kind of repressive machinery. And by the 1890s, you see this coming all together. The Spanish-American War, the start of formal American empire, the sort of end of the, and so it's all, hand in hand. And you get the, Wilmington race riot in North Carolina. That's the kind of last hurrah of Reconstruction. So I want to see it all unwinding. And that's another way I think that my book will be a little different than conventional histories of Reconstruction that just end in 1877 with the so-called compromise. I want to look at how it unwinds and how, different notions of the state become dominant in the United States, and how that is a defeat, actually, for the vision of an anti-slavery state.
So based on that, I have another question about like a popular myth that a lot of people were talking about recently, right? It was Juneteenth, obviously it was months ago, but people have been talking about it since then, that enslaved people didn't free themselves. The 13th Amendment freed them. And so I guess my question is, when the 13th Amendment is finally passed, and then the 14th Amendment, what does it actually do? Does it actually solve the problems? Or because you focus so well in your first book on South Carolina, like, do you see that states and the federal government apply these amendments differently than they were intended?
Absolutely. So the notion that, enslaved people had no role in emancipation, luckily has been debunked widely. And first we had these like really simplistic debates on who freed the slaves. Was it Lincoln? Was it the slaves themselves? Or was it the constitutional amendment? And the idea, of course, I mean, you guys know this, you study history, and that we don't study history in these kind of isolated, simple events kind of way. I mean, if you look at emancipation as a process, there are many actors, historical actors, that contribute to it, including the enslaved, right? You have enslaved people, running to the Union Army lines and seeing the Union Army and seeing Lincoln as their liberators before they formally accept the roles themselves. Now, this doesn't mean that there was no anti-slavery content to their politics. Clearly was. That's why the South secedes when Lincoln is elected, because an anti-slavery president has been elected in a slaveholding republic where slaveholders have actually dominated the government for the longest time. So if you see emancipation as a more complex process in which the enslaved play a role, in which you have Congress playing a role, in which you have abolitionists who have been agitating for this for decades playing a role, you get a fuller and more complex history of emancipation. I think the 13th Amendment is kind of an endpoint. It's not the starting point. It's the end point to that story of, abolitionist activism before the war, of, enslaved people voting with their feet during the war, of congressional radical Republicans bringing the abolitionist agenda to Congress, passing confiscation acts, actually wanting to confiscate property on a very large scale and redistribute it. They're not successful in it. But again, I think historians have underestimated how strong the momentum was for doing those kinds of things. So yeah, it's a far more nuanced and complex story than most historians would tell you, or the way it's written in textbooks. Having said that, I think the 13th Amendment is really important, for a lot, because of Ava DuVernay's documentary, The 13th. A lot of people have looked at the 13th Amendment very suspiciously as sort of virtually conspiratorially, that this was a way to, that criminal exception was one way to contain Black freedom, right, after emancipation. But the authors of the 13th Amendment were all anti-slavery men. They had no idea of, trying to undermine Black freedom. What you do actually have is Southern states taking advantage of that criminal exception loophole to criminalize Black freedom and contain it. And that's the story. And so I think we have to be mindful of how it is misused in the South. But if you think about the 13th Amendment, it has a second clause that says Congress can pass any legislation to enforce the freedom of Black people. Now that's like the sleeping giant of the 13th Amendment. It means the federal government can pretty much do anything to make sure that states don't contravene citizenship rights. And we could still use it today against voter suppression if we wanted to. The 14th Amendment is even better because they have a clause saying if you deny the right to vote to any segment of your population, you will suffer a loss in representation in Congress. It has never been triggered. It never was when the South had Jim Crow. And I keep thinking we need to implement that clause of the 14th Amendment, make them suffer a loss in Congress and the Electoral College if they suppress the vote. And it's there in the 14th Amendment. And not to get carried away, I'm sorry, but what I want to say about the 14th Amendment is that a lot of our modern expansion of rights, things that we are really troubled about today, the right to privacy in Roe v. Wade, gay marriage, no discrimination on the basis of sex, that all comes from the 14th Amendment. So an amendment that was there to enfranchise former slaves has been used by disparate groups in American history, especially in recent years, to expand rights because its language is so broad and so egalitarian. Despite the fact that it introduced the word male in the US Constitution for the first time, it's still, that clause actually refers to persons, and it has been used now by women. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg used it for her famous argument against discrimination on the basis of sex. It still is a living amendment because it's still a rights-giving amendment. And of course, national birthright citizenship for immigrants like you and me.
Yeah. So, I guess we should move to Q&A and
Well, could I ask a follow-up first?
Go ahead.
So let me ask a follow-up first because this is really wonderful, and it gets to something that I think Varsha, you and I have been talking about with our guests kind of consistently, is that especially when we're talking with American historians, like there's been such a public conversation about what American history is, and I think one of the things that I really love about what you're saying right now, and in all of your work as well, is your ability to kind of to bring to the fore marginalized voices, right? And I think I'm thinking about like the debate about the 1619 project, like most especially, but everything about this. I mean, there was a great column, I think Jamel Bowie, who wrote a column in the New York Times about kind of related to the Amy Coney Barrett nomination about like, well, what does originalism mean in the context of the radical transformation that the Constitution underwent with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? So how do you do that, like as a historian, is to look for people's voices that a dominant narrative, through the teaching of American history is focused so much on kind of white men, especially, but thinking about how do you bring those other voices to the fore, I guess?
Yeah, so it's really important to see how African Americans have used appeals to the Constitution and made freedom claims based on looking at the Constitution or even the law as an instrument of liberation, right? And they can only do that because of the Reconstruction Constitution amendments. And conservatives are not pretty consistent. They can go on about originalism, and Bowie's right. When it comes to the Reconstruction amendments, you read the debates and you know exactly what they're about. But what did the Supreme Court do in the Gilded Age? They used the 14th Amendment to protect the right of corporations. The whole idea, corporations are people, gets extended even further. So I think that even the originalism argument, it's not a principled one. It's clearly a political argument. And the notion that somehow that they have the better interpretation because they're originalists, which is what Amy Coney Barrett, who couldn't, by the way, name the 5 protections of the First Amendment, which killed me as a historian of abolition, because the one she missed was right to petition. And that was a huge issue in the history of abolition because of the gag rule in Congress. So I'm like, really? You missed that? And you're, well, in any case. So, and people are like, oh, it's a gotcha question. I'm like, well, it was asked by a Republican senator. It was like a softball. And she was supposed to hit it through the ballpark, what she did.
But it was asked by Ben Sass in order to encourage Amy Coney Barrett to show that she knows the Constitution. And it's the First Amendment. Like, it's not even like, sometimes my students mix up 19th and 21st. I understand that. but it's the First Amendment. And so like this week, I'm teaching my students to read, my students are reading the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence this past few weeks, and they've been reading an abridged version of Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And like, so one thing they've learned is, or one thing they've sort of gained is, there are a lot of like issues with democracy. And so since your second book, and I promise we'll go to Q&A after this. I'm sorry, I thought of another question. Yeah. Since your second book is focused on this like reconstruction of how democracy is reconstructed after the end of the Civil War, do you think, like, what do you think the major mistakes were during Reconstruction? And if there were major mistakes, or obviously there were, when does Reconstruction actually get overthrown? Is it 1877 or is it later?
So in terms of mistakes, for so long, the historiography, which is what Eric was writing against, the so-called Dunning School, had sort of dwelt on the mistakes of Reconstruction, the problems. And of course, Du Bois had written Black Reconstruction, talking about marginalized voices, Matt. The subtitle of that book is The Role Black Folk Played in Reconstructing Democracy, in case you missed the idea, right, in America. And so, the tendency was, in fact, to highlight the achievements of Reconstruction, including, getting democracy into the South and, having a public school system and things like that. I think the problem in Reconstruction is that the South is never really defeated. And the Democratic Party in the 19th century, and those of you who read too much Dinesh D'Souza, everything you know about the political parties today, please flip it for the 19th century. It is a party of white supremacy and conservatism and states' rights, and the Republican Party is the party of racial liberalism, anti-slavery, of Reconstruction, and of big government, actually. And so, there were so many positive things that happened at that time, but at the same time, they had to constantly compromise. So I'm reading over all the congressional debates and all the debates in the state legislatures and the conventions about these things. And all the time they have to accommodate these hardcore racists and democratic opposition. So for instance, the question of land. I mean, if Johnson had not returned the Sherman land grants, and then they were unable, they kept trying the Freedmen's Bureau bill to put it back in to make sure that those land would be permanently redistributed amongst freed people. And they were not successful because there was so much opposition. There were conservatives within the Republican Party, there was a Democrat, and they had to constantly, negotiate with them. And Thaddeus Stevens, I love Thaddeus Stevens.
I love him.
I know. Thaddeus Stevens said it the best, right? I keep telling my husband, if I was going to leave you for a guy, I'd probably leave you for Thaddeus Stevens. And he's long dead and gone. Thaddeus Stevens, he bemoans this, he accepts the compromises and he says, I know I'm not dealing with angels, I'm dealing with men. And that in order to get what I want, I have to constantly, and he tries his best by hook or by crook to reintroduce the question of land. And others do too, like George Julian and Sumner in the Senate, and they're not successful, right, in the end. So I think that was, it's the way the American political system is supposed to operate. All those little checks and balances and the president and the Congress and all the compromises. You don't get what you get in a parliamentary system, which is a far more majoritarian, straight out look. I mean, even the presidency is a pretty powerful position. You'd asked earlier on about why do people venerate these guys? Because they're virtually like semi-monarchs, right? At least it was designed to be like that, right? People like Washington and Lincoln, they have so much power. You realize how much power the president has, and sometimes unaccountable power in the United States. And it can be a little frightening, but especially now. But, except that they're just so incompetent and kleptocratic that he's not been able to probably done enough damage. But in any case, to get back to matters at hand, why 1877? Your question, a lot of historians, including Eric, sees 1877 as the ending of Reconstruction. I don't. I see a gradual winding down. 1877 begins that process of the winding down of Reconstruction. And it's really not until the 1890s that you see the complete and absolute overthrow of Reconstruction. So it's a gradual process. It's not as if, instantly federal troops are taken away. That happens. But you still have some local Black political power. You still have pockets of Black voting. You still have Wilmington, etc. Then you have that cataclysmic riot. You still have, some other options coming up in Virginia, North Carolina, opposing the so-called redemption, but which is really a counter-revolution of white supremacy. So I think it's important in talking about Reconstruction to talk about all those events that happened then, the gradual winding down.
So I think we do need to get to Q&A, and I'm sorry, it's my fault I kind of derailed the movement to Q&A because we have some really wonderful questions, and I want to make sure that we get to them. So, so one of the things that's kind of a thread through a couple of questions, and I'm trying to kind of combine stuff so we can get to as many as we can, is about the Western theater, because both in the Civil War and then kind of the role that plays, especially the U.S. engagement. Engagement is too soft a word with the Native Americans in the West as well. And so how does that play in? Like, how do you teach that integration? I think that oftentimes, right, we tend to think of the Civil War, the American Civil War and Reconstruction as something that happens only east of the Mississippi, right? But that's absolutely not the case. So how do you kind of integrate the West into your teaching or into your research?
And I think it is important to do that, because you're writing again an incomplete history if you do not integrate Western history. So, there's so much good work now being done on the Western theater in the Civil War. A lot of really good work on Native Americans and Indian Territory in Oklahoma, and how the different Indian nations negotiated the Civil War, which sides they fought on, whether they had, in fact, slavery amongst themselves, how the 13th and 14th Amendments are actually implemented in some of the Indian nations, and the contestations within these nations of people of African descent who are sometimes enslaved. So it's a complicated story. It's not a simple thing. And I don't see myself as a complete expert on this. So I'm really happy to see all the recent scholarship on it. I do think it's important not to fall into like simple and facile generalizations based on one event or one thing happening. I think a model for this is actually Stacy Smith's book on California, on Reconstruction there, where she looks at the ways in which Indian peonage, other kinds of servitude, Chinese exclusion, all these things play into the politics of Reconstruction. And I loved it because I came across this awful guy, a Democrat from California called McDougal, who was just such a vicious racist. You read his speeches in the Congressional Globe and you want to puke, because the guy is just a straight out racist. And he has this peculiar Western mixture of anti-Black, anti-Indian racism. And it really sticks out at you because they're just so open. And it's not as if people are not calling them out on it. Henry Wilson, the anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts, says the vulgarity and barbarity of these speeches appalls him. So, people then are saying this is really bad, and so abolitionists. So it's actually right there. All the civil rights laws that are passed, all the amendments that are passed, they always talk about Indians not taxed. So there's a recognition that there are Native American nations there who will not fall under the purview of many of these amendments and laws. There's also a recognition, there's some senators from the Midwest who say there are Native nations here who have adopted, quote, the white man's ways, who are citizens. So they should have access to that. So it's, again, a far more complicated question. It's not just, it's a question of sovereignty for Indians, not just citizenship. No, they're like all these different situations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and then in California, and then separate Indian nations. And then there's McDougal, of course, who says, how do we, what he calls digger Indians, in his mind, people who who are quote not civilized, etc. How do we compare them with Indians who have accepted quote the white man's ways, etc.? So they're talking about Native Americans all the time. So this notion that somehow all this is separate is really not accurate. I think we do need to integrate Western history in our histories of the war and Reconstruction.
Yeah. So there's another really great question from Kathleen. She asks if there are historical parallels you see with the overthrow of the first Reconstruction with what Republicans are doing now, with what you would consider a general liberal democracy since the passage of like the VRA and Brown v. Board of Education. Is this also a similar slow process of an overthrow of like an attempt to bring an integrated democracy?
That's a great question, because of course we can't do simple parallelisms because history never kind of simply repeats itself, right? But there are some interesting ways in which that legacy lives on. So if you look at the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, or the fact that, civil rights activists call themselves the new abolitionists, they call what they were doing the second reconstruction of American democracy. I think we are poised at the third. We should have a third reconstruction of American democracy because Republicans have, in fact, made that their agenda to really push back against the gains of the civil rights movement, leave alone the unfinished business of, wealth disparities and economic inequality and systemic racism and mass incarceration and all that. Leave that aside. Even the basic political citizenship question, they're constantly attacking this stuff. And just as they're constantly attacking the New Deal state. So it seems that a kind of a very consistent reactionary politics that is trying to undo some of these things. So the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, in Shelby County versus Holder, was totally Reconstruction. You say race doesn't matter. That's exactly how the South gutted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They didn't do it by disfranchising all Black people. They did it through grandfather clauses. Yeah, if you're an enslaved person, it's probably your grandfather didn't vote. So if you have a grandfather clause, you can't vote. Or literacy tests, or Constitution, read the Constitution and know it. If Amy Coney Barrett can't, answer a simple question about the First Amendment to the US Constitution, you're asking a free person then to recite the Constitution back to you. And there were Black people who did that. African Americans who actually learned the US Constitution and then went and recited it and was still disfranchised, right? So I think I see a lot of parallels. There's these dog whistles, this pretense that, it's about voter integrity, whatever that means. It's clearly voter suppression, the good old style. And the states that are really adept at doing it, I mean, the Midwest has learned quite a bit, but the states that are very adept at doing it are the former Confederacy, are the places where Reconstruction took place.
Yeah. So I guess another question. Oh, do you want to go, Matt?
No, please go ahead.
Another really great question somebody asked is, so Stephen asked, if South Carolina hadn't seceded, do you think so this is a question I asked the undergrads, and I think it's like one of the questions that a lot of undergrads are asked, is the Civil War inevitable? And basically that's the type of question he's asking. If the South hadn't seceded, would another state have seceded? Was the Civil War inevitable? And I know it's a very comps-like question, but
yeah.
I just
counterfactuals. So, when I was writing the book on South Carolina, it seemed kind of obvious that South Carolina would secede. I mean, there are large numbers of South Carolinians who were ready to secede in 1830, for God's sake. But you had Andrew Jackson, an anti-abolitionist slaveholding president. They were ready to secede then, right? They were ready to secede in 1850 over the admission of California as a free state into the Union. So it makes sense that South Carolina would secede. It totally makes sense to me. And your cat agrees, Matt.
She does, yes, she does.
But what I traced in my book on the counter-revolution of slavery is that South Carolina in the 1850s is no longer an outlier. Many of the Deep South states, like Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, are pretty much one-party states, the way South Carolina was for a long time. So if South Carolina didn't, and there was a quote cooperationist movement that said a bunch of southern states should secede together, and South Carolina was like, hell with that, we're not waiting, we're just seceding. And then of course the dominoes fall and all the others follow the South Carolinians. It's quite likely that any of one of those deep South states that seceded before the firing on Fort Sumter would have seceded. Maybe not the upper South states, and they in fact secede after the firing on Fort Sumter in 1861. But most of them secede, remember, because they cannot accept the results of a democratic election. So that's how anti-democratic and pro-slavery those governments had become. And if you look at the elections of the secession convention, certainly in South Carolina, they're non-competitive. There's one person. It's like those deep red states today, it's people don't vote hard. The voting percentage is low. It has all the features of an authoritarian state, which is what they create with the Confederacy.
Yeah. One of the things that so we're almost out of time, and I have two questions, so I'm going to try to get them in, and but one of the questions there are several questions here are kind of related to kind of K-12 education. And that's I think that's one of the greatest things I've seen change since just my time kind of in the academy is more attentiveness within academia to the way that history is being taught in K-12 and an attempt at kind of outreach. So if you could kind of change, like you just wave a wand and change like one thing about the way that American history, Civil War, Reconstruction, antebellum America, something like that. One thing about the way that things are changed, like that could be textbooks or whatever, like what would it be?
Oh, loaded question. The one thing that I would really change is not to ghettoize American history. You know how we teach American history? There's like the grand narrative. Oh, and then there are women, and then there are Blacks, and then there are immigrants.
Oh no.
Let's combine it all together instead of saying this or that. It's just a simple thing to me. I just find it troubling that people do that. And I think that's when you lose the bigger picture. That's when you can talk about, the amendments and not talk about African Americans at all, or talk about African Americans and not talk about the amendments at all. That's just not the way politics works. That's not the way, as Douglas put it, that's not the way power works, in that, okay, then we conquered the West and Native Americans just disappeared, or, we can talk about African Americans only when we talk about slavery, or, can't we tell more complete, more nuanced, more complex stories about the United States? And that history is compelling, because when I teach survey courses and Civil War courses with, large numbers of students, many of them kind of conservative and resistant, sometimes even to things that I'm saying, you can reach them by just telling the more complex, the more nuanced story. And so say, hey, you're talking rubbish. That has nothing to do with it. The tariff had nothing to do with it. It's all about slavery. I'm like, no, yes, it was there, but let me tell you how it was connected to slavery, I would like to do that. I would like to bring more complexity into US history in telling, because our past is pretty complex.
I just want to say, the reason I fell in love with US history is because, oddly enough, all the different schools I went to in the US did ghettoize American history like that. I distinctly remember 8th grade when we spent a huge couple months on slavery and then a huge couple months on just Ellis Island. And I remember having questions, wait, did these immigrants get along with African Americans? What happened to the African Americans? We were just talking about them. And so I think we can't underestimate American school children, even school children that are in middle school or high school. Like they genuinely want to understand this full story. And if you actually tell them the full story, they just become like that's like, so basically American history taught me how to be a citizen. So I think if you treat high schoolers and K-12 students as like with a little more respect, they'll be able to tell you that they can take on more, right? And so I think you're exactly right. Like that's one of the biggest mistakes we make. We don't really talk about it, right? Like
absolutely
splitting it up into units, and that just like it breaks up history, right? You jump out from piece to piece.
You create an artificial division. So that and then you reinforce divisions today. You know, one of my friends always says the history is an activist muse, but it is a lesson in citizenship. You know, and there's a way to talk about it. I actually just did a talk yesterday for middle schoolers from 5th to 8th grade for the Gardner School in Washington State. It was Zoom, and it was really interesting that you could reach those kids with pretty complex stories about the Civil War and Reconstruction. You know, you didn't have to tell it in a certain way. You could tell it in a way that would make sense to them. But, you know, they get it. They get it. And I do a lot of teacher education through the Gilder Lehrman Institute. And so I feel it is important to reach that audience, that broad audience. And that's why I'm doing this Reconstruction book the way I'm doing it right now. It's going to be a shorter book, but it's going to be a book that I think speaks to some of the concerns we have today about our democracy. And I think it's important to do that. And most people, you know, the average person on the street who is, you know, you can reach them with this stuff. I mean, I was surprised with the abolition book. Like, people told me so big, those their world. And I think historians are doing a disservice by not getting to them. Even medievalists can do that.
I agree.
Man.
Yeah.
Right.
Even medievalists can do that. That's right. So, and I mean, I think that's in some ways, I mean, that's a wonderful way to kind of wind up. I mean, I think the thing that all of us here, and certainly so many people we've talked to, some of the people we've had email us, you know, about the show and stuff like that, is it's the fact that history isn't a simple story, right? It's that it's complicated, right? And that people can handle those complications. Like they want that. And that's different than telling a good story. Like you can tell a good story that has nuance and texture and can take everything into account and do that in an incredibly compelling way. And people want that, right? Like people desire that, and that gets them excited about studying it. But where if they're spoon-fed something that like, no, it's this and it's not the other thing, that's the stuff of fake, you know, history conferences that are held at the U.S. archives that are, you know, instruments of authoritarian rule. But we won't get into that right now. So
yeah,
and trust me, it can even happen with people on the left, right? Sometimes I read a book and I agree with the person's politics, but the book is goddamn awful because it's just you know. And there could be somebody who's like really conservative, whose politics I totally disagree with, but the guy really spent the time in the archives. So yeah, you did your work, but your conclusions are all wrong. So you know, I think we also have to be a little mindful of how we do history, because if it's not authentic, you know, people are going to see right through it.
Yeah. I think the key thing we've learned is to stick to the archives. If you're trying to understand about secession and why it happened, try to teach history, stick to the archives.
I'm a total archive nerd. I love the archives.
I miss them so much. I cannot stand.
All day today. I was at the American Antiquarian Society all day, steeped in 19th century newspapers. I just love it. It's like, you know, I literally feel the blood rushing, and I get excited about finding stuff. And so that's why I'm in such a good mood today, because I'm big nugget. So it's open just for the long-term fellows, and we all sit like 20 feet apart from each other. It's just 3 or 4 of us in this huge hall that's usually crowded. It's shut to the public. We all wear masks. It's open only 3 days a week, but I get to go to the archives. in the pandemic. And it's like,
oh,
guys.
that's amazing.
That sounds like heaven. Oh,
Really,
I cheers to that, Manisha. That's amazing.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we are about out of time. So let me say, let me echo Varsha, and let me simply say cheers to Manisha. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a wonderful conversation. Please, we'll have this up on YouTube hopefully tomorrow if I can get my computer to be working like it should be sometimes. We'll have our next episode will actually be in 2 weeks. Eric Rauchway from the University of California at Davis will be joining us. It will be a post-election episode, which if you can believe it, is
happening. So if you are an American citizen, I implore you to vote. I have dropped off my ballot. Please take the conversation we've just had with Manisha to heart and treat your citizenship as the prize that it is and go vote. Yes. I can't tell you who to vote for, but please vote.
I mean, we could, but
we could, but we won't.
You can guess probably. So the other thing I'll just mention really quickly is that if you look on Twitter, we have made a list of, due to popular demand, of all the books that our guests have written, have suggested and stuff like that. So take a look at that if you want to see, you want suggestions for further reading. And also I'll do a shout out too, because somebody mentioned this, is that support your local bookseller. They're going through a really hard time right now in the pandemic. So if you can, please throw them a little money when you're thinking about where to purchase your books. So, but with that being said, let me say thank you again for joining us, and to everybody, have a wonderful Friday. Enjoy your weekend, and cheers.
Yes.
Cheers.
Thank you, and vote.
Please vote.
Vote.